Caitlin Clark argue with Stephanie White. Caitlin trying to communicate with the team. Look at her. Now Stephanie White's talking to Caitlin. And Caitlin Clark just said like this. Stephanie, what are you talking? She's like, Caitlin just, and then look at Stephanie White and her having a dispute.
And that was something that
another dispute on camera. Going to Stephanie White, trying to hear her out. And Caitlin's trying to explain to Stephanie White. Stephanie White with a rebuttal. I'm talking about right here. Right here. Stephanie White, how about you go right there? How about you go right there, please? I'm tired of the back and forth. Every time Caitlin says A, you say B. How about you? Yeah, Caitlin, let's try A. For God's sake, I've never seen you agree with Caitlin Clark on camera. My girl?
Stop everything you are doing right now. Put down your phone, pause whatever you are watching, and pay close attention to what I am about to tell you, because what is unfolding inside the Indiana Fever organization right now is not just a basketball story. It is not just a coaching dispute. It is not just another slow news cycle drama manufactured by social media algorithms looking for clicks and engagement. What is happening in Indianapolis right now is a full-scale organizational earthquake, and the aftershocks are going to reshape the entire landscape of women's basketball for years to come. You have already seen the footage. You have already watched it with your own eyes, and no matter how many times the corporate sports networks try to minimize it, rationalize it, or package it into something digestible and safe for mainstream consumption, you cannot unsee what that sideline camera captured. Caitlin Clark, the most transformative athlete women's basketball has ever produced, standing on her own team's sideline, throwing her hands up in visible frustration, locking eyes with her head coach, and refusing to back down. That single moment changed everything. That moment was not born overnight. It was not a random emotional outburst from a player having a bad day. That moment was the inevitable volcanic eruption of weeks of suppressed tension, philosophical conflict, and a deeply fundamental disagreement about what Indiana Fever basketball is supposed to look like in the era of its most important player. And today, we are going to break down every single layer of this organizational disaster, because the mainstream sports media does not have the courage to tell you the complete, unfiltered truth. But this channel does. Welcome back to Simply Explained. And today, we are going all the way in. Let us start at the beginning of this particular chapter, because context matters enormously when you are trying to understand how a team arrives at a moment of open sideline conflict between its franchise player and its head coach. The leaked sideline footage that spread across every major social media platform like a digital wildfire showed something that casual sports fans rarely get to witness in real time. It showed the actual human cost of a philosophical mismatch between a generational athlete and a coaching staff that appears fundamentally incapable of getting out of its own way. In the footage, Caitlin Clark is visibly attempting to communicate something critical to her coaching staff during a timeout. Her body language is urgent. Her eyes are intense. She is not throwing a tantrum. She is not being disrespectful. She is doing what every elite competitor does when they see something on the floor that the coaching staff is missing from the bench. She is trying to share critical real-time information about what she is experiencing against the defense. And Stephanie White's response? Cold, dismissive, completely unwilling to genuinely engage with what her franchise player is attempting to communicate. The moment Caitlin looks directly at White and expresses her clear frustration, the internet absolutely erupted. Comment sections filled up within minutes. Clips were reposted thousands of times. The hashtag demanding changes to the coaching staff began trending nationally before the final buzzer even sounded. But here is what the mainstream outlets refuse to discuss honestly. The real scandal is not that Caitlin Clark expressed frustration during a timeout. The real scandal is that she has apparently been forced into a situation where expressing basic competitive frustration has become necessary in the first place. Here is the thing about organizational dysfunction. It rarely announces itself with a single dramatic moment. It builds slowly, quietly, and methodically through a series of smaller decisions, subtle slights, and consistent patterns of behavior that only become undeniable when the pressure finally reaches its breaking point. And when you study the patterns surrounding Stephanie White's management of Caitlin Clark with completely honest eyes, the picture that emerges is deeply troubling. Start with the post-game press conferences, because that is where coaching philosophy reveals itself most nakedly. After Caitlin Clark delivered one of the most spectacular individual fourth-quarter performances this league has witnessed in years against the Washington Mystics, burying 5 consecutive contested three-pointers from distances that would make most professional male guards flinch, Stephanie White stepped behind the microphone and talked about collective effort, group energy, and everybody contributing to the team's success. everybody contributing. That was her primary takeaway after her franchise player single-handedly rescued the game from the jaws of defeat through sheer individual brilliance and elite competitive will. Now contrast that with how the same coaching staff responds when veteran role players have efficient individual scoring nights. Suddenly, the language changes completely. Suddenly, the microphone becomes a vehicle for specific, individual, deeply personal praise. Suddenly, that particular player is a leader, a warrior, a franchise cornerstone putting the team on her back. The double standard is not subtle. It is architectural. It is embedded in the fundamental way this coaching staff chooses to communicate publicly about its roster, and it sends a very clear message, not just to the player herself, but to every teammate, every front office observer, and every media member watching carefully. And this is precisely why the leaked sideline footage carries so much emotional weight for the fan base, because it did not happen in a vacuum. It happened against the backdrop of a consistent pattern of minimization that has been building since the very first day of training camp. Now let us move from the emotional and psychological dimensions of this conflict into the actual basketball mechanics, because this is where the real damage is being done to this franchise's competitive ceiling. Caitlin Clark's entire offensive identity is built around pace, space, and the weaponization of her deep shooting range to create gravitational force that transforms the entire offensive ecosystem around her. When she pushes the ball in transition, when she catches it at the logo and rises up before the defense has time to organize and rotate, when she fires those full-court skip passes to cutting teammates who suddenly find themselves completely wide open because every defender on the floor is terrified of leaving her with space, she is not just scoring points. She is fundamentally breaking the structural integrity of opposing defenses in ways that create scoring opportunities for every single player around her. That is what made Iowa basketball must-see television for 4 consecutive years. That is what filled arenas across the country to capacity. That is what broke every single television viewership record in the history of women's basketball. That pace and space, instinct-driven, transition-heavy offensive identity is the product itself. It is the reason the Indiana Fever became a legitimate cultural phenomenon overnight. And Stephanie White wants to run a controlled, methodical, half-court motion offense that asks Caitlin Clark to stand patiently on the perimeter while the ball rotates passively from player to player, and the shot clock counts down towards 0. Think about the sheer competitive insanity of that philosophical choice. You do not purchase a revolutionary supersonic aircraft and then instruct the pilot to observe the posted speed limits on the interstate highway. You do not hire the most electrifying offensive engine in the history of your sport and then ask her to function within a rigid structural system designed for a completely different era of basketball. And yet, here we are, multiple games into a regular season where the Indiana Fever's offensive output fluctuates wildly and unpredictably based entirely on whether Caitlin Clark is being allowed to play her natural instinctive game, or whether she is being forced to conform to a philosophical framework that actively suppresses her greatest competitive advantages. The statistical evidence makes this argument airtight. During stretches of games where Clark is allowed to push tempo, create off instinct, and operate at the speed her basketball IQ naturally demands, the Indiana Fever's offensive efficiency spikes dramatically. During stretches where the coaching staff insists on slowing the pace, running half-court sets, and reducing the number of early shot clock possessions, the offense devolves into a stagnant, isolation-heavy, structurally predictable mess that competent defensive coordinators around the league are already beginning to exploit systematically. And when Caitlin inevitably tries to push the pace against the coaching staff's explicit wishes, when she instinctively attacks a transition opportunity or fires a high-risk creative pass that her exceptional basketball processing tells her is the right play, the cameras consistently catch Stephanie White on the sideline responding with crossed arms, visible grimaces, and the unmistakable body language of a coach who views her superstar's instinctive genius as an act of personal defiance rather than elite competitive expression. If you needed a single piece of concrete evidence that this coaching staff is operating without a coherent, stable philosophical foundation, look no further than the complete chaos surrounding the team's rotation management this season. Multiple games into the regular season schedule, and the Indiana Fever have not yet established a consistent starting lineup. Not because the roster lacks talent, not because there are genuine injury complications forcing constant adjustments, but because the coaching staff appears genuinely uncertain about what combination of players produces the best on-court results. When a reporter directly confronted Stephanie White about this reality during a post-game media session, pointing out explicitly that the team has altered its rotation in virtually every game of the season, her response was a masterpiece of corporate deflection. She talked about still trying to figure out what combinations work best. She mentioned that the team has individuals who can score and individuals who can defend but lacks consistency across 4 quarters. She repeated variations of the phrase "it takes time" with the practiced regularity of someone trying to preemptively construct a protective narrative shield against future accountability. It takes time. That is the philosophical foundation of the Indiana Fever's coaching staff right now. It takes time. Keep putting one foot in front of the other. Keep trying to get 1% better every day. Keep 5 people on a string. Meanwhile, the most dynamic offensive player in the history of this league is sitting on your bench during critical game stretches because the coaching staff pulled her at the exact moment. Her scoring streak began building dangerous momentum, and the team's offensive rhythm collapses completely in her absence while the lead quietly evaporates into a tie game. This is not strategic roster management. This is organizational chaos being dressed up in the comfortable language of process and patience. There was a moment during one of the recent post-game media sessions that crystallized the entire philosophical problem with stunning clarity. A reporter, clearly having watched the same game tape as everyone else in the arena, made a genuine effort to get Stephanie White to specifically acknowledge and celebrate Caitlin Clark's individual brilliance. The reporter noted that this particular performance looked like the most complete, balanced game Clark had delivered in nearly 10 months. The reporter pointed out that she had been extraordinarily efficient, doing enormous damage with minimal shot volume, and asked White to identify what specific element of Caitlin's game looked most fully recovered and sharpest. Stephanie White's answer? Burst. She talked about burst. She mentioned it multiple times with notable emphasis. She discussed how you could see the burst when Clark was pushing the ball up the floor, how you could see it in the elevated lift of her jump shot, how her physical movement patterns and athletic burst were clearly back at full capacity. Now, I want you to think carefully about what that answer actually communicates beneath its surface-level positivity. By reducing Caitlin Clark's entire extraordinary performance to a purely physical athletic attribute, the head coach is subtly but deliberately stripping away all intellectual credit for her dominance. She's not acknowledging the elite basketball IQ that allows Clark to read defensive rotations before they develop. She's not recognizing the generational court vision that produces those spectacular creative passes. She's not celebrating the tactical sophistication that allows her to manufacture highly efficient shots with minimal wasted possessions. She is talking about her like she is a supremely gifted athlete who happens to run fast and jump high. That is not praise. That is passive-aggressive minimization delivered with a smile and a microphone, and it is happening in full public view while the mainstream sports media nods along without questioning it. The organized fan response to this unfolding situation has been remarkably swift and remarkably unified in its clarity of purpose. The digital coalition operating under the banner of the Fire Stephanie White movement is not simply a collection of emotionally reactive supporters who cannot handle competitive adversity or a difficult stretch of early season basketball. It represents a legitimate, data-informed assessment of a fundamental philosophical mismatch between a coaching staff and its franchise player that is actively harming the team's competitive trajectory. These fans watched the leaked sideline footage and did not see an uncoachable diva throwing a public tantrum. They saw a supremely intelligent basketball player who has been pushed past her patience threshold by a coaching staff that consistently refuses to genuinely listen to her competitive input, consistently minimizes her individual contributions in public forums, and consistently forces her to operate within a philosophical framework that actively suppresses the qualities that make her the most valuable player in the league. And the fan community's response has been essentially unanimous in its fundamental assessment. You cannot build a championship organization around a generational superstar while simultaneously treating that superstar's competitive instincts as a problem to be managed and controlled rather than an asset to be unlocked and maximized. Some voices within the fan base urged caution. They expressed concern that the viral footage would paint Caitlin Clark in an unflattering light, feeding a media narrative about her being difficult or uncoachable that could follow her through her career. And while that concern comes from a genuinely protective place, it fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the moment. The footage should not be hidden. The footage should not be sanitized or explained away. Because what that footage actually shows is a competitor who loves this game enough to fight for it, even when fighting means directly confronting the authority structure above her. That is not a character flaw. That is elite competitive spirit expressing itself exactly as it should when the situation demands it. At some point in this narrative, the conversation has to turn toward the people who possess the actual institutional power to address this organizational crisis before it permanently damages one of the most valuable assets in professional sports. General Manager Lynn Dunn and the Fever's executive leadership team are currently sitting on a powder keg, and they appear either genuinely unaware of how close to detonation it is, or they are hoping that public pressure subsides before they are forced to make an uncomfortable decision about their head coach. Neither of those approaches is acceptable given what is at stake. Let me be completely transparent about the financial and competitive reality here. Caitlin Clark did not just save the Indiana Fever basketball franchise. She completely resurrected it from a state of deep cultural and commercial irrelevance. She packed arenas that were previously averaging embarrassingly low attendance numbers. She generated television viewership figures that shattered every record in the league's history. She created a level of national mainstream cultural conversation around women's basketball that had not existed since the founding generation of the sport. That is an organizational debt of enormous magnitude, and it demands a corresponding level of organizational commitment to creating the conditions under which she can thrive athletically and professionally. Protecting a head coach's bruised ego at the direct expense of that commitment is not just a basketball mistake. It is a catastrophic business failure. The rumors circulating through the digital community are accurate, and Stephanie White genuinely attempted to pursue some form of institutional punishment or restriction against Caitlin Clark for publicly expressing competitive frustration during a timeout. Then the front office's response to that information needs to be swift, decisive, and unambiguous. You do not punish greatness for refusing to be suppressed. You restructure the environment around it until it can flourish without restriction. Here is my honest assessment of where the Indiana Fever organization stands right now, and where this conflict is ultimately heading if nothing structurally changes in the immediate short term. The tension between Caitlin Clark and Stephanie White has already passed the point where time alone can heal it. The philosophical gap between Clark's instinctive, pace and space, transition-heavy basketball identity, and White's controlled, deliberate motion offense preferences is not a minor stylistic difference that can be bridged through mutual compromise and good faith communication. It is a foundational incompatibility that touches every single possession of every single game this team plays. Every time Clark pushes the tempo instinctively and makes the right play, while the sideline grimaces in visible disapproval, the wedge gets slightly wider. Every time a press conference concludes with vague collective talking points instead of specific individual acknowledgement, the psychological distance increases. Every time a rotation change pulls Clark off the floor at precisely the moment her competitive momentum is building, the frustration compounds. And at some point, that compounding frustration reaches a threshold that no amount of team chemistry, locker room culture, or organizational patience can contain. The Indiana Fever's front office has a narrow but critically important window to address this situation decisively before it reaches that irreversible threshold. That window will not remain open indefinitely. The basketball season does not pause for organizational soul-searching. Let me bring everything back to where we started, because the most important thing about that leaked sideline footage is not the conflict it captured. It is the conversation it should be forcing everyone within the Indiana Fever organization to have honestly and immediately. Caitlin Clark standing on that sideline, throwing her hands up, refusing to quietly accept a situation that she clearly believes is harming her team's competitive potential, is not a crisis to be managed. It is information to be acted upon. It is a generational talent communicating in the clearest possible terms that the current structure is not working, that the philosophical framework being imposed on her game is incompatible with the qualities that make her exceptional, that the pattern of minimization, the rotation chaos, the sideline grimaces, and the press conference deflections have accumulated into something she is no longer willing to silently absorb. The Indiana Fever have a choice right now. They can protect the comfortable illusion of organizational stability by closing ranks around a coaching staff that is fundamentally mismanaging the most important player in the franchise's history. Or they can look honestly at the cold reality of what is happening on their sideline, in their film room, and behind their locker room doors, and make the difficult organizational decision that this moment demands. One of those choices builds a championship foundation. The other one wastes an opportunity that organizations wait decades to receive and often never see again. The digital streets are watching, the fans are watching, and most importantly, Caitlin Clark is watching to see whether the people who run this franchise value her enough to act. This is simply explained: stay locked in, stay informed, and never let the corporate narrative replace the truth. We out. Peace.